Welcome everyone to our Action 13 Town Hall, Closing the Gap, Educating Our Hispanic Students. Thank you for joining us. My name is Elisa Rivas. I am an anchor and reporter here at ABC 13 and so thankful, even grateful to get to discuss this topic with a wonderful panel of experts this evening. Let me first say how important this issue is to me personally. Although my family has been here for more than a couple of generations now, descendants from Mexico, I will say that I was raised by my grandparents. Neither had a high school education, but that basically meant that they knew the importance of education and they ensured that I stayed on the right track to get my own education. And while I would never describe myself as a student that struggled, I did recognize the differences along the way that perhaps language barriers would make, cultural differences would make. I was so thankful to go to a university that extended scholarship specifically to students of color and was a beneficiary of that. So with that said, a wonderful and important topic for all of us. Let me introduce to you our panelists for our Action 13 Town Hall this evening. First of all, Andy Canales, Executive Director for Latinos for Education, Greater Houston. Dr. Catherine Horn, Director of the University of Houston Education Research Center. Elizabeth Alba Santos, Houston ISD Board of Trustees, District 1. Juliet Stipeche, Director of Education for the Houston Mayor's Office. Margaret Rodriguez, Superintendent of AAMA's George I. Sanchez Charter School. And Maritza Guerrero, CEO of Community Family Centers. Thanks to everyone for joining us this evening. I want to begin our conversation by recognizing some of what the research and data already tells us about what's happening in our Hispanic Latino communities in terms of our children's education. So let's take a look at those numbers now. Inequality and Hispanic students. Latino students are 2 to 3 years behind white students of the same age on average. 43% of Latinos are below basic on math and reading compared to 17% of white students. And only 11% of Latino students are college ready by the time they graduate high school. The source coming from research company McKinsey & Company, National Assessment of Educational Progress, and Latinos for Education. So that is where we are as a country. We recognize a lot of that happening here in the Houston area as well. I should say that we received many questions from our viewers. We solicited questions because we wanted the town hall to be about what our viewers are wondering about, what our viewers' concerns are. And so the topic of the moment, of course, is COVID-19 and its extreme impact on our children's education. And we're focusing tonight on the Hispanic community. So we received a question from Fifi Robinson, who lives in A-Leaf. Fifi identifies as a teacher, although not necessarily in the A-Leaf district, but lives in A-Leaf. And she did write to us, concerned about the COVID crisis, asking, most of my missing students are Latinos. What is being done or put in place to find these children, as so many are in a virtual classroom right now. So I'd like to direct that one to Elizabeth Santos, as you are sitting on the HISD board. I know you can't speak for all school districts, but talk about any concerns that we might have for the Latino community, specifically when it comes to being missing from our virtual classrooms.
Thank you, Elisa. So I know that HISD has we're down 36,000 our enrollment for the start of the school year. We have not reached 12,200 students. And I will say that it has been difficult because we have lack of communication, whether it's via the media. I know Telemundo and Univision have made efforts to have answers from our HISD administration, and with however busy they are, they haven't been able to reach, back out to the Telemundo or Univision. But again, having an outreach program through all outlets, social media and the media, and Telemundo and Univision. I mean, I'm first generation Mexican American. Both my parents are from Mexico. And I know that we keep our Univision and Telemundo playing throughout our household, and I know that many of our students do too. So I was a student with HISD, a volunteer with HISD, a 10-year veteran teacher with HISD, now a board member, and I reflect the Latino population. And I come from a poor neighborhood, still live in the neighborhood, but we are trying to make, I mean, I'm trying to go out there and on our avenues of social media, be able to ensure our families, that, hey, this is going to be an avenue that we can battle together. But we do definitely need more representation when it comes to being able to speak Spanish. So it hurts us when we don't.
Is there anybody else who'd like to comment on that in particular?
Yeah, I would like to respond to what Trustee Santos mentioned in terms of the language barrier. I think what's particularly challenging about this crisis is that it's exacerbating existing inequities. And so I remember vividly when I was a 6th grade teacher, when a student came into my classroom who only spoke Spanish, the systems were not there to either help me help that student or to help that student be able to navigate a whole new world for them. And so now they're going through that virtually. I have a family member who was helping her child, my nephew, in her classroom. And she said there was a student in the classroom who only speaks Spanish, and she was asking questions in Spanish, and she and her mom just finally gave up and logged off. And so what's just really difficult about the situation is that there has been consistently a language barrier across all of our systems for our students and our families to access resources. And that's what we're seeing firsthand now through this virtual learning experience across many school districts.
And I want to echo that. We do have the greater affected are the immigrant families, the poorly resourced, right? And the language and cultural barriers that exist. We have a pretty good population of Guatemalan families that live in our community, and they are not Spanish speakers. You know, we have to communicate with the translator, so that language barrier exists. And our schools are about 1,000 students, total district. We were lucky. We did find most of our students. Those that we could not, we did have evidence that they moved somewhere else to either back to their country or were one of those disenfranchised communities. The language barrier, technology, and all of those, they exist. And that's one of our focus, you know, the technology piece, that digital divide that exists, not only for our regular students that are living in the communities, have been here multiple generations, but those that are from other countries and aren't as aware.
I think we're living in unprecedented times in terms of the fact that in the spring we saw this dramatic transition where folks were like, you're not going to be going to the schoolhouse down the street. And now we have a period of time of the summer where there was a dramatic opportunity to try to bridge the digital divide as quickly and dramatically as possible. And yet there's still a tremendous need to deploy devices and internet access to families and children. And then once you get those devices, you're going to have to know how to use them. And so, you know, we've been talking about digital fluency being this three-legged stool with hardware, internet access, and then the digital fluency. So it's not a simple, every year at the start of the year, there's a reduction in the number of children that are reporting, and it steadily declines with time. And that takes rigorous effort on the school district and the teachers, you know, conversing with parents and getting them on board. Now you have a complicating factor, another structural barrier that makes it even more challenging, further demonstrating the inequities and the problems that exist.
When we talk about the language barrier, for many of our students, they enter the education system already on their way through elementary, middle school, high school. Let's talk a little bit about small children, though. Shannon Hernandez in Tomball, who identifies as an education specialist, is concerned about small children. We're talking ages 3 and 4, who perhaps show up to the education system already behind. She asks, how can we help the community to combat this issue even before preschool and during preschool?
I want to touch on that because early childhood is very dear to my heart. Early childhood quality education and training for teachers is a top priority. It is between that time that they are able to learn and reach kindergarten and read. What we find is a gap that 50% of the children are not even reading by the time they get to kindergarten, which hinders along the course of the rest of their education, their ability to really understand and learn and comprehend. So having said that, tackling that is taking children to locations, even they've been talking about with the home care, the parents that do home care, to have them specialize, or not specialize, but train them to help them with their vocabulary, reading aspects, and so that they can reach some level of vocabulary. And children many times are behind in vocabulary when they haven't gotten to pre-K or when they haven't gotten to kindergarten. And considering that most of in the Hispanic community, we find that a lot of the children are still being at home and are not going necessarily to childcare or pre-K, which limits, again, access to education.
And Catherine, speak to this too, because how are there perhaps strengths in the community that could speak to this problem of children showing up at school already behind?
Yeah, I think what Maritza raises is really critical. I think that the city has invested substantially in this space, and I think for good reason and toward increasingly good ends. As an example, the Children's Museum of Houston has partnered with Texas Children's Hospitals and community centers around the city, supported by Powell Foundation, the Episcopal Health Foundation, and others, to implement a Welcome Baby program. And it really reinforces exactly what Maritza shares, which is that early conversations with infants reading in English and Spanish, because research emphasizes the fact that dual literacy begins from infancy and moves forward, and really engaging with children from the earliest ages into their preschool and beyond is essential. Because if you come in ready and on level to engage at the pre-K and kindergarten work, what we know from research is that sets you up for success. And there are mechanisms that the city is engaging in at low or no cost to families that are really in support of that goal.
And I do want to jump in too, if you don't mind, Elisa, but we want to go to the root cause as to why families aren't being engaged or aren't reading to their children at an early on age, whether it's because there is a language barrier or a cultural barrier. So for longstanding, we've dealt with redlining, we've dealt with institutional racism here, so much so that we had huelga schools back in 1979, Juliet, if you can help me with that. But I know that we've had a history of racism, even when integrating HISD back in 1978, where Latinos were classified as white so that we could combine our African American and our Latino students, so to comply with federal guidelines of integration. And so whenever you have a concentrated amount of poverty in one central area, that becomes problematic. I mean, like a Latina, I mean, I just had a baby. Well, not just, he's 10 months old. And I wouldn't give my baby over to just anybody. I mean, I've had to turn down at my job because of the pandemic, because I wanted to stay home with him. There's nobody else that I would trust with him, especially during a global pandemic. And so now to ask a culture, a community to give their pride and joy, their treasures to us and say, hey, HISD, we trust that you're going to have enough PPE. We trust that you're going to have socially distanced classrooms and that you're going to, you have the best interests of our children. I stayed home. I'm not going to put my child at risk. But going back just to the root cause of this, like, yes, these programs are beautiful and they're, but how accessible are they? And, or does the community trust those that are coming in to say, hey, we've got this this resource, come and use it. Or the fact that communication is key. When I speak to my community, it's not necessarily coded language, but it's in a way that they know that I'm real and that I'm honest and that they can trust me. So when a lot of outsiders come in, they don't trust that. And just again, we're just going back to the root cause as to why our community decides not to partake in a lot of these is because it's from an outside force that they may or may not trust. Additionally, those high concentration of areas that are impoverished, like we cannot address the achievement gap without discussing poverty.
Absolutely. So I did actually, receive that very question or something along those lines, very much all wrapped up in together. We had Carl Williams in Houston. Actually, let me see. Let's do Louis Cruz in West Houston, identifies as an IT analyst. And he did talk about the topic of institutional justice in education. When you're talking about institutional racism, poverty, all of the additional factors of what might be impacting a Latino student's education. He says, what good is education if we do not address the underlying systemic racism in the United States? And, many people may or may not want to argue that exists in the education system. But if in fact it does, what are some of the ways in which we can tackle that? This question might take us a while, but go ahead and I'll go ahead and say, Juliet, why don't you go ahead and start for us?
So, is there racism in the educational institutions that exist today? Yes. Is it systemic? Absolutely. Does the system need to be dramatically transformed? Yes. And how do we do that? So I think the thing is, Latino students, just looking at the history in the past, blatant, dramatic, known discrimination, then separate and unequal. Brown versus Board of Education, unconstitutional. Other cases, Hernandez versus Texas. That's what Elizabeth was talking about in terms of Latinos being designated as a class of their own, a class apart, because we were being treated as whites when it was convenient and treated as Mexicans at all other times, in terms of not being able to use the same restroom, be at the same counter, and systemic racism. And so then you have a system today, post-Brown versus Board of Education, almost 50 plus years later, where we still have a system that is dramatically inequitable based on the statistics that we started this discussion with, saying 11% of Latinos are college and career ready. That is a system that is not empowering the community to be able to succeed at the level comparable to other communities. What is the cause of that? There are structural barriers that exist preventing all communities from being able to succeed. So now I would say one of the most overarching systems that continues the systemic racism is the system of low expectations for Latino children, saying we are not going to give them AP courses. We are not going to challenge them with rigorous classes. We are going to not give them these various programs because we don't expect them to be able to respond to them. And that is a flawed system that's based on a racist ideology. All children, especially, right when they come out of the womb, that's when they're having the most neurons in their brains and they need exposure to learning and love and nurturing and care. And then finding that classroom setting that's going to have that amazing teacher and the programs that are needed and the resources. The system today also has to be designed to be able to provide them with nutrition, health and well-being, social emotional learning, and all these various supports, the wraparound services, the community schools that we've been talking about that can help children responding to their needs that exist today, to the communities that they serve, and allowing parents and the community to have a seat at the table in the decision-making process.
Andy, you want to take the next part?
Yeah, I would love to build on what Juliet just shared in terms of some of the structural things that are holding our kids back. We were talking about early childhood education. For instance, kindergarten is not even mandatory in the state of Texas. I've spoken with principals that have told me that they've had children walk into their schools for the first time in first grade. We know that only 1 in 3 Latino third graders are reading on grade level in third grade. As a society, we should be doing everything in our power to put our best, our brightest teachers in front of children from pre-K through third grade, and we should be supporting those teachers. And so I hate whenever I drive on a highway and I see a billboard that says, want to be a teacher? When can you start? When would you ever see that for a doctor, for a pediatrician, or for any other profession? Yet our teachers in those grades are brain building our students. In South Korea, they call them nation builders. When we see the school to prison pipeline and the fact that Black boys particularly are more likely to be suspended at higher rates than their white counterparts, we also see another example of a structure that is holding many of our students back. And so I agree that there's a lot of things, but I think what's hopeful is that we have the power to change these things. In the last legislative session, for instance, many education advocates, including many people in this virtual room, lobbied for increased funding for pre-K. And so the state legislature did allocate more money for pre-K, and that was a step forward. And there's a lot more of those steps that we're gonna have to take to address the system.
And I also agree that there is a lot of positive. I think when we talk about our Latino families, they are resilient. They do have that admiration and trust in their schools. They know their children can do better. You know, aside from the barriers that exist, the language and so forth, they want a partner. And I think that's our opportunity as educators, as those practitioners, to engage those parents. You know, with COVID, it is about creating a different structure, right? It's we can't be in our classrooms right now physically. So what's it going to take? You know, beyond COVID, we need to embrace and utilize that technology piece that we're using now. And learning for the parents as well. I think there's a lot of stressors in the families and at school and teachers and all the way around. It's about helping each other because technology is not going to go away. It has entered the schools. We need to have a one-on-one student device moving forward for every student. Elementary grades too. Imagine that if elementary students, middle school and high school students just utilize technology throughout those years, you would have that experience of just building those career pathways for our students right now. Some of the students at my high school didn't have a laptop before they went to college. We did that, you know. But that's kind of the norm for others in other communities. We need that for our students as well. And I think this is an opportunity for schools and teachers, like I said, and parents and community to partner. Who is that school down the street, you know, business partner, community partner? What do they need? Because we are educating those students that are going to be the employees of the future. Let's provide them those tools. So it's not bleak in my eyes. I think these are opportunities we have to make and creating that hybrid model of, yes, students in the classroom, but students on technology. And it can be year round. You don't physically have to be in the classroom any longer. We've learned that.
I'd like to jump in just on the fact that, and building on what Margaret is saying, that it's a great opportunity, technology at this point, even though there's a gap in technology, because many of our children do not have the resources, do not have the technology as it was stated before. At the same time, we have to consider how do we help the parents, because especially for the elementary children, how do we help the children and their parents be able to utilize technology? There's a gap in language many times. So can we make it part of our ESL, GED classes? Do we make it part of, how do we improve them to be able to support their children? They want to, they sometimes just don't know how to. And as a community and a society, it should be upon us to be able to support that transition in education for the adults and for the children.
And if I could just very quickly and offer a comment back in support of what Andy and Juliet both said, I think that the tackling of implicit bias and really taking a very serious, proactive effort to understand what people are bringing, the assumptions that they're making when they're coming into the classrooms, when they're working with students, that shapes the experiences that students have is really essential. The city has invested in taking up that effort across districts, and I think that, again, to the betterment of the experiences that all of our students and families will experience. I think the other point that's really essential, and you've heard this recurring, is the role of the teacher. And the value of a high quality teacher in every classroom cannot be overstated. And I think one piece that is especially important is the reality right now that fewer than 3 in 10 of our public school teachers in the state of Texas at the moment is a Hispanic teacher. And we know that seeing and valuing students who are in, are the kids who are in their families, and for kids seeing students who are their mothers and their dads and their aunts and their uncles in the person who is taking them through this learning journey is critical.
And I want to,
Go ahead.
Hi, I'm sorry. I just want to piggyback a little bit after what Dr. Horn said. But yeah, you're absolutely correct. I mean, public education, everybody thinks that it's about the tools that we have, but it's about buy-in. We have to get our kids to understand that what we're selling to them, which is the idea of public education. And I'm going to respectfully push back about the digital divide. Yes, there is a digital divide, but more so than a digital divide, there is a lack of resources that we're talking, and going back to Juliet's point, the digital fluency. I mean, if we can't get our kids to read, but yet you're asking them to take their phone and write an essay, either on their phone or through technology, and the idea that a computer can replace a teacher, that, I'm sorry, but with every year of experience a teacher has, they come back and they build those relationships with students. You can identify with your teacher. You can say, hey, that teacher looks like me. That teacher has long black hair, dark skin. You know what? Maybe she comes from where I come from, and she understands where I'm coming from. So I'm going to pay attention to her, as opposed to someone that has implicit biases that come into the classroom. And if you're from a completely different community, completely different upbringing, you come into a poor community, you come into my community, and you try to tell me what's good for me. I 9 times out of 10 can tell you, my kids at the age of 16. When I was a 27-year-old teacher, at the age of 16, although I was teaching the school where I graduated, had more life experience at the age of 16 than I did at the age of 27. So when you have 22 and 23-year-old 1 and 2 year teachers come into communities of color that don't understand and that don't have the experience for the teachers, like veteran teachers, 5 years and above, you're going to have hiccups, and you're going to have kids that don't have buy-in. So I'm all for this digital, closing the achievement gap and closing, but it goes back to the root cause. We need teachers that have experience. We need resources. We need our kids to read. And the only way that you're going to do that is when you educate a community and give them the resources that they need. And for too long, yes, HB3 was a wonderful addition to finances, but it came back with a lot of strings attached to it. When we talk about pre-K, but we don't talk about the funding that is tied to it, that our kids have to take tests. Our kids are more than a number, they're more than a test. And when we talk about merit and we talk about the measures that we use to close the achievement gap, we've been given racist policies by people way up top that say our kids have to take a test that's completely culturally biased. The STAR test is the most horrible test written out there, and our kids have to pass it to deem them, that they're worthy of something. When it's our kids are more than a test, and the achievement is measuring it by success of somebody else's, what they deem successful. So, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Not at all. I think what I'd like to touch on, based on some of the comments you were making there, we have what is perhaps a cultural language barrier, but let's talk about broader resources, because to learn English is to have comprehension in another language. But I was speaking with former student who talked about, learning English 4th and 5th grade. And once he spoke English, he had a stutter, which then was causing anxiety. A mom that was working 3 jobs, which then caused more behavioral issues and acting out. I mean, these are all issues that now as an adult, he can look back and identify. So what kind of resources are needed to not just address the language barrier, which is primary, but then additional challenges that students face based on their life circumstances? And I didn't even add special needs to the list, just things like dyslexia, dysgraphia, any kind of additional special need that a student might have to bridge the learning gap between where they are and staying grade level with peers.
If I can just take a stab at that, I know that we're going to get a lot of input from these amazing other colleagues as well. But when I served on the HISD school board, I wondered, I was like, we have all these programs, we're spending all this funding, and these results, we're not seeing the results that we want, right? And we started saying, how in the world can a child learn when they are so stressed about food, housing, their family, whether they're children with parents that are undocumented could suffer tremendous amounts of anxiety. The University of Houston just issued a report talking about how it's crippling. And also just other factors in terms of, the mobility of trying to find housing that's affordable and going from place to place, trying to find the lowest cost rent. So before COVID, Professor Kleinberg and the Kinder study did an evaluation. Before COVID, there was a very small number of people in Houston that had $400 extra in their pocket to be able to handle a crisis or emergency. And these are the types of situations that families are going through today. So HISD and other school districts have looked at the community schools model or wraparound services, saying what can we do to provide services to meet Maslow's hierarchy of needs in terms of making sure that a child is in a space where they feel comfortable, where they feel calm, and where they can learn. And at the same time, you've got to have a great teacher. We have to have more culturally sensitive, aware teachers also that are bilingual and that are, aware of the needs and the beauty of the diverse communities that they're serving. But first and foremost, it's like schools have become one of the primary social service providers in a community, especially those that are long underserved, that are isolated, and that are away from the other side of town. Those communities look to the schools for great resources. And that became extraordinarily indicative, and the community became very aware of that during Hurricane Harvey. When the storm hit, the schoolhouse was a place of safety where you could get a warm meal, you can get water, and you could get access to internet services and a computer. COVID closed down the schoolhouse. So we had to rely on nonprofit partners, government entities, and other persons to provide support to the community that was so embedded in those local schoolhouses. So, I say that, and I open this up, of course, to my colleagues, but the idea that the schoolhouse is just a place to be able to have kids graduate, that is an absolute essential function. But in order to get a child across the finish line, in order to get them to succeed so that way they can go to college or an apprentice program or follow their passions and dreams, we need to be able to build a stronger community, to be able to nurture and provide the supports to families to give the children what they need to be able to learn in that classroom.
And I agree, Maslow's hierarchy is exactly the place to start, because students are not going to be attentive if they don't have their essential needs. Families aren't going to be ready to send their kids to school if they don't have the housing, the food, nutrition. I think the partnering that you did see over COVID, we host Brighter Bites on Tuesdays, and there's lines of families. You can see that social emotional learning piece. I'm so happy, elated that has taken off. We have done that for so many years at our school. We understand that we're going to get students who have different counseling needs, not the academic counseling, college and so forth, but the crisis counseling, the grief counseling, the suicidal counseling. All of those things exist, and they exist at lower and lower grades. So that social emotional piece is huge right now at the schools. Yes, with disasters that happen, with COVID, exactly the same. They're missing their peers. They're missing that interaction that we have with our students in the schoolhouse. And we're having to do more with our students, for our students, on a regular basis. And I think that's the need, that's the call. We take students where they are, right? For academics, whether they're a special population, special education, gifted and talented, what have you, English language learners. You take them from where they are, you work with them and their entire family, and you watch the success that happens, because it needs to be tailor-made. Unfortunately, that's where we exist. Maybe that we should have done this for many years prior to this, but it's alive and well. And right now, I think it's a time to really focus on that, restructure what it's been. And as far as assessments, we should assess on their growth, because they're going to progress. If we have great teachers in the classroom that understand that social emotional is what happens first, we should be better off.
I want to touch on what Margaret mentioned in terms of the social emotional needs. At Latinos for Education, we surveyed several hundred Latino Spanish-speaking low-income families across Houston. We asked 4 open-ended questions, and we did that purposely as opposed to asking multiple choice questions, because we wanted to understand what's on their minds. And when we asked the question, how has COVID-19 impacted the well-being of your children? Nearly half of the parents wrote paragraphs that either cited the decline or the deterioration of their children's mental health. They most often use words as anxious, sad, depressed, worried, unstable to describe their children during this time. And I think that this is an opportunity, as Margaret was mentioning, to really rethink our system and to go beyond education. In Texas, for instance, we have the highest number of uninsured people in the whole country. 1/3 of Latinos in Texas don't have access to health insurance. So even if they desire to access mental health services and support, it is cost prohibitive, and they don't have the opportunity to do that. Texas is one of 12 states that has not expanded access to Medicaid, and 5 other mostly conservative states have done it, including most recently Oklahoma. So if Oklahoma can do it and other states can do it, we can do it too, because it's going to benefit not just our families, but our students' emotional well-being as well. And we have to think about all of these things when we talk about closing the gap for our students.
I would like to talk about solutions during this hour. We're getting into the second half hour now. And I have heard kind of sprinkled in some things that need to be addressed or that would work if we only had this. So not to put you on the spot, and I'm sure I'm not, because I know these are issues that all of you think about on a daily basis, but if you can identify one thing that you think would make things better, it's not going to be better with just one thing, right? But if we could, if there's something that you think is reasonable, is doable, that we're just not doing right now, or just have not found the resources or political will to do, but that could work to help reach students and help them to achieve more, like what would that thing be? And I'm gonna go through everybody and have everybody answer, because I want to hear those ideas that are come up into your head late at night, or that cross your mind when you're in the middle of a situation, you think this is what we need to be doing. So do I have any takers on answering first from our panel? The panel gets quiet now. All right, so I'm going to go back and I'm going to pick on you, Elizabeth. You've been our most lively person in the discussion so far tonight. And I know, like you said, you've already really expressed a lot of things that need to be happening. But if we need, like you've been talking a lot tonight about how we need to get people, you need to get people more trusting of the system. That also means that we need to have a system that's trustworthy, right? But how do you feel like we can really get into our neighborhoods that most need it and bridge that gap?
Thank you, Elisa. I mean, if I had a magic wand, I would change the funding formula for the state of Texas for public education. But I don't have a magic wand, so I'm going to go back to representation. When you have someone that looks like you, that walks like you, that talks like you, someone that has your best interest at heart, someone that truly values students, community, and parents, then and only then are you going to have that buy-in.
Well, let me stop you there and ask you though. So how do we why aren't there more? And how do you think, as part of, if this is, a huge part of the solution, and I can see how that is so important, how do you inspire more to do that?
Lisa, if we had another maybe 3 days to talk about this issue, I will say this much, and I'm gonna put, be vulnerable here and say this. So, the position that I work in is an unpaid position, and Juliet can talk about that. And I had to give up my livelihood to be able to serve on this board. And so when Andy talks about people not having access to healthcare, it is definitely hit home, especially during this pandemic. So when you have high-level policies that are in fact either classes racism that's rooted in classism, because that means that only wealthy people can serve in the position that I currently serve in, then you're not going to have that representation. You're not going to have that representation, that buy-in. I mean, our campaign was a completely grassroots campaign, $7, $8, $10 donations from all my former students and community members and teachers. So, it has been a struggle to serve our community and to represent the best interests of students. So until we have buy-in from the Latino community to have people they trust, because we feel, and myself included, that the system has let us down. I graduated from Sam Houston High School, which is no longer there. The HISD board shut down Sam Houston because of these merit darn tests that the state administers to us. But my high school is no longer there. And we've never had anybody that walks, talks, represents the Latino community, despite, District 1 having 32,655 students. 96% of those students are Latino students. 60% of them, 23,650, live on the east side of 45, where I grew up. We've never had somebody that represents us. And it was definitely a Cinderella story. But until we have representation, Elisa, but we can't address these high-level policies that have unintended consequences on poor communities like mine. And you know what, Elisa, I'm going to go back to what your original point was like, you had grandparents that cared for you and that knew, that stressed the value of education. But many of my former students don't even have that. They have their grown-ups, their people, their guardians that come in and try to do the best with it they can. And to send them to a system that has continuously failed them. And that's why we had the huelga schools. That's why we had charter schools formed, because our public schools weren't serving the best interests of our community, because we never had representation that would advocate for resources to be put into poor communities. So it's very high level, and I know that wasn't a solution that you were looking for, but I guess to the viewers out there, trust that there are people still willing to do the right thing, the next right thing by our students. And to everybody else that they're willing to serve your community, come on out, and hopefully that we can get some good people to represent us out there.
I think the fact that, I think that what you expressed right there is a simple fact that it is a solution and that it can be done. So when I ask you, how do we inspire people? Maybe you just did, Elizabeth. How about that? All right. Who's next?
I'll go next.
Yeah.
I want to say we've opened the door to technology. We've created that awareness across the United States that students have to be remote. And that meant we may have another pandemic, another hurricane, all of these things. That's the way we can stay connected. We've proven that, yes, those disparities exist. That's where we can get the partnerships, corporations, community members. It's not very expensive to buy a device. You can buy a device for under $200 right now. We can't get them because everybody needs them, but that door has opened and I think there's no going back. I think once you have a device in a student's hands, new doors open for them and their families. I think if we expect them to do well in the future, in the careers of the future that are going to include technology, they already do. The disadvantage is that our students of color don't have them, but let's fix that. I think that advocacy piece on behalf of the students in Texas and across the US has to be, let's put our money where our mouth is, because if we want our students to be successful and go into these careers and into the STEM fields, well, let's provide them with a tool that they can easily access from the elementary schools. It's going to take a while for everybody to have one at the schools, but I don't see how we can go back and not have technology. You would have asked me 20 years ago, are we going to be in a technology age? I think we've been sitting in classroom rows for too long, and corporate America and all other industries have moved technology in that technology direction. It's about time that the schools do too. It's been a very long time that we've needed to do this.
Andy, how about you?
Yeah, I'm thinking back to my experience as a sixth grade teacher. I had students that came into my classroom reading anywhere from a kindergarten level to a sixth grade reading level. And something that I noticed in my students who were performing on grade level is that they had access to stronger classrooms and to a stronger quality early childhood education early on. So if I had a magic wand, what I would wish for our city, for our state, and for our country is that we have a world-class universal pre-K program where every family that so desires is able to send their children to not just a classroom for babysitting, but to a high-quality classroom where the children are able to grow, thrive, and learn, because that sets the foundation for future and successful learning based on all of the research study after research study that reinforces that. So that's what I would offer.
I would like to just piggyback on Andy. The reality is that what we do see and we do know from research again is that with quality early childhood, within a generation, the cycle of poverty can be broken because they will be able to aspire to education, be it associate degrees or go to college and be able to be productive citizens, of course, have better opportunities and jobs. So that for me is really tremendously important. I wish that our early childhood as a whole would definitely focus on the quality and that the funds be there. One of the things talking about what I think would really help as well is the continued advocacy. I think the advocacy is so important for our community, that the Latinos leaders of today, because I see them rising, it's very hopeful that they continue advocating at the legislature, at our state, at all levels, and at the communities so that the changes continue to happen. They don't happen on their own. They happen with a lot of push, with a lot of people speaking up. So I think that advocacy is an incredible tool, an important tool to continue to focus and promote change.
Kathy, how about you?
I go back to Elizabeth's comment and build on that. I think that investment in a growing and well-prepared Hispanic teacher force is a powerful investment for good. And I think that we have great examples of that. Two I'll note really quickly. One is a partnership between the University of Houston and the Houston Independent School District, Teach Forward Houston. And it is an effort to go into the schools and be connected with the students who are in the high schools in HISD, bring them onto our campus, which is proudly a Hispanic serving institution, put them in a space where we prepare them well to go back into their district, the Houston Independent School District, and be with the students who are their neighbors, who are their sisters, who are their brothers, and who eventually are their kids. And I think that kind of full investment from community, from university, from district together toward common ends is a really powerful recognition that these are efforts that require a collective investment, not singular investment in one place or the other. The second that I think is similarly important happening at a broader state level is growing Texas teachers scholarships that the Raise Your Hand Texas Foundation has invested in. Again, this is a recognition that becoming a public school teacher or a public charter school teacher in the state of Texas is an act of service. It's an act of importance that's so valuable that we're willing to put dollars behind that investment so that not only can the best and brightest students be in pursuit of teaching as a career, but that ultimately our students benefit from that investment.
Juliet, did I get to you on this question, or have you already said your piece on the topic of solutions?
I have not. And
Go ahead.
I'd add something. So here we've had amazing input, the necessity of representation, the need for greater funding, training teachers, early quality childcare, early childhood education, pre-K, use of technology and bridging the digital divide, training the next generation from our community in a grassroots way. Every single one of them, diverse, needing to support our community. Serving as the mayor's director of education, I've had this amazing opportunity to meet with K through 12, early childhood centers, nonprofits, post-secondary. And from that, I see that our K through 12 system the state has demanded a Herculean effort of our schools to be able to address systemic societal issues that are just so tremendous and so grave. Being at the Mayor's Office of Education, I've looked and seen the importance of collaboration, coordination, and communication amongst the school entities, the corporations, the government entities. Everybody's focus should be on making sure that we enhance educational equity and opportunity for all children, focused on designing a system that is responsive to our most vulnerable children. And also, if I had a magic wand, I would make sure that the city of Houston and everyone is aware of the Convention of the Rights of Children. And that is something that is an international document that can provide us with what are the necessities, the rights of children that every single one of us should advocate for. These are a set of principles and guides that are followed by countries internationally, every single country around the world, but for the United States. Houston is the first city to be a part of UNICEF International and USA, the Child Friendly Cities Initiative. We are working on this effort. And you can take a look at this document. It provides just basically, in a nutshell, it takes all of the things that we've just described, puts it into one single document, and allows families, parents, children, and communities to be able to understand these are the rights that are inherent to your well-being, your right to an educational opportunity experience that is equitable and just, and gives you an opportunity to be able to set a framework and change your mindset, knowing that what we have now is inadequate in order for us to be able to compete globally in the future.
So we have a few minutes left. I would love for Brandon, if you could help us out and put up the screen that we have about the cost of the achievement gap. I acknowledge that most of the people watching here are going to be those that are personally affected by this issue, but really everybody is, even if you think you are not. The cost of the achievement gap in the US, $310 to $525 billion. And by addressing inequalities experienced by Hispanic and Black students, researchers estimate that the GDP of the United States would have been $310 to $525 billion higher in 2008. So this is a number provided by McKinsey and Company research, but still from a decade ago. Imagine what the number would be now. And I want to just ask in general, if you feel like we have corporations and other community partners that recognize this enough to help be a part of the solution. Because as Latinos, like, we help ourselves, right? We do for ourselves. We are hard workers. But like I've heard so many of you say, resources are essential and it's going to take a community buy-in. So I would love to hear your thoughts on that number and how the lack of education and opportunities for the Hispanic community has perhaps led to, what could be if only we would help those among us that are struggling.
Every community is going to be evaluated in the future on how it empowers its most vulnerable. And if you do not empower the most vulnerable, then you're going to see statistics like what you just demonstrated. Every single person on this call had a teacher, a champion, a hero, a loved one that inspired them to be able to get the education and the necessity of supports to develop the social emotional learning, to go through the rigorous system to be a leader today. Every single child that I have met has that same passion and ability. It's like a seed needs to be planted in fertile soil and watered and given sun and have people tend to it in the most gentlest of ways to allow it to grow and flourish. And that is the same dedication that all our leaders need to be able to focus on, to say, how can we work collaboratively? How can we open up doors to make it easier for companies to be able to provide donations, tell us what they need in the workforce, and be able to allow the teachers to say, this is what I'm challenged with. Can you help me? How can you help me? And what can we do together? It goes back to the message of complete communities, building a better tomorrow, making sure that all people who are at risk and at stake are at the table making parts of the decision and the plans that are going into place. So that way it's not top down, it's bottom up, and we're all working together to make a better, brighter tomorrow.
I think, what I would underscore is that since 2005, there's been an increase of 800,000 Latino students across the state of Texas. It's as if an entire state of people moved into our state. And it is in our best interest, in everybody's best interest, to make sure that our Latino students are succeeding. 80% of the young people across Houston under the age of 18 are either Black or Latino. And so if Houston and corporations and our neighbors, whether you identify as Latino or not, if we're all interested in ensuring that this city is prosperous, that it's thriving, and that it's a world-class city, we need to make sure that we're investing in these students and making sure that they have the resources and supports to succeed.
And just to go back to Juliet's point, that seed, Juliet, that seed that we need to be fertile with, yes, it is everybody combined, but my commitment to public education is not to be a babysitter, but to empower teachers that are on the front lines every day, talking, not just talking to our kids, but buying groceries, making sure our kids are not evicted from their home, all of those things. But we need to re-professionalize the teaching profession. Like, we have taken so much and devalued teachers, and now people are seeing teachers' worth. So there's no computer program, there's no anything that can take away that passion, that empathy, and there's so much divisiveness going on right now, and putting teachers down. But we don't need to head down that direction. We need to move forward to the direction of empathy. And right now, parents that are out there having to teach our students, it's a struggle every day, and your reality isn't somebody else's reality, and your best isn't somebody else's best. So again, just honoring teachers for the professionals that they are, because they are the ones on the front line, and not having somebody else force their beliefs upon a community, specifically back to Dr. When we have people with buy-in, and you can identify with that $310 to $525 billion, human talent goes a long way. So thank you.
So we can't do it alone, right? In education, we can't. We look to those who are the experts in their field that are going to be able to support our students and the college and career pathways that we build, that look at early learning and invest money because they see the results. There is research. I mean, that's evident that students do progress if they have early learning skills. So one, the awareness has happened. I think it's about advocacy at this point. We know that there is a digital divide. We know that there are just so many needs that students have that we've all talked about this evening. The awareness, it's on the news, it's on the media, what's happening with students of color, just in education and just everywhere across the state of Texas. So what is that initiative? What is that call to action that we need to have posted at every school and every district? What is the call to action that's going to say, partner with us? These are going to be the results if you give us this. It is about our data. It's about how we manage the funds that we have and how to produce those data results, because there needs to be just general plan in Texas that's going to collaborate with a corporate America, with nonprofits in education. And it's very possible. It happens with a lot of other situations and calls to action. We can do that for education. It would behoove us not to do that. We need to.
So we have approached 8 o'clock, and I'm going to go ahead and wrap up our discussion this evening. I want to thank each one of you for joining us. I know the challenges are great, but hearing you articulate what you are seeing with your own eyes, what you are understanding from the data that you spend hours poring over and gathering, it's important, and I appreciate your time so much. We are recapping our discussion tonight on Eyewitness News at 10, and then you can watch the town hall in its entirety at abc13.com if you happen to join us late. But again, thank you to everyone for joining us this evening on this incredibly important topic.